This is Joanna Short from Augustana College. Today we're going to use measuring worth to show how to find today's value of a commodity from the past. As an example, we'll use the price of a 1909 Model T Ford. This is the same example as I used in Tutorial 1, which you can find on measuringworth.com. A Model T Ford, in particular the Touring model, was priced at $850 when it was introduced in 1909. This doesn't seem like much to us today. That's because prices tend to rise over time. There's been a lot of inflation between 1909 and today. However, earnings were a lot lower in 1909 too, so $850 still could have represented a lot of money back then. In fact, car sales really took off later, as the price of a Model T fell to as low as $290 in 1925. The question then is, how much was that? We need a way to convert that $850 to its value today. Commonly, people use the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, to do this calculation. The CPI is a measure of the average cost in urban areas for a basket of consumer goods and services. We can use the CPI to see how much, on average, did consumer prices rise from 1909 to today. We can then apply that increase or inflate the $850 into what it would be in today's dollars. In essence, we're finding if we took $850 in 1909 and increased it at the same rate as average inflation, how much would it be today? There are two ways we can use measuring worth to help us with this calculation. First, we can find the annualized growth rate of the CPI from 1909 to 2015, then calculate the total growth of $850 over this time period. The formula looks like this. Here, the G stands for the annualized growth rate of the CPI, and the N represents the number of years the CPI is growing or compounding over time. So let's go to measuring worth, and I can show you where we can find this G. Now we're on measuringworth.com, and over here under the comparators, we'll choose the first link for annualized growth rates. Now you can see that we can calculate the growth in many statistics, like wages or GDP in the US, those kinds of statistics in Britain, and also even gold prices. Notice too that in parentheses we have the date ranges that each of these statistics are available. Now, as I speak in early 2016, most of the US statistics are already available through 2015. The rest will be posted as soon as they are ready. So let's choose the Consumer Price Index, and we'll enter the years that we want. In this case, we would like to go from 1909 to 2015. Now, you can see that we get an annualized growth rate in the Consumer Price Index of 3.15%. Now, this means that the CPI increased on average by 3.15% per year between 1909 and 2015. Now, let's go back to our slides and we can plug it back into our formula. Now, let's enter what we found for G into this formula. Recall that we found an annualized growth rate of 3.15%, and in decimals that would be 0.0315. Now I've also entered in 106 for N, that's the number of years between 1909 and 2015. So if you plug this part into your calculator, you should get something close to 26.8. This means that if prices increase by about 3.15% per year over 106 years, that means the prices will increase overall by a factor of 26.8. Okay, once we multiply that by $850, we get $22,780, something similar to a basic small car today. Now, a second way we can do this calculation is to let Measuring Worth do all of the calculating for us. We can use what's called the Relative Values US Dollar Comparator to do all of the work for us. So let's go to Measuring Worth again, and I'll show you how to do this. Now here in Measuring Worth, we're going to go to this link for relative values, US dollar. Notice too that there are similar comparators for the British pound and the Australian pound, but we want the US dollar. Okay, now we want to type in the initial year, the initial amount, and the desired year. So let's enter 1909 for the initial year. The initial amount is $850, and our desired year is 2015. Okay, notice that if I were doing this a little bit earlier in 2016, some of the 2015 statistics might not be ready, and we might have to choose 2014 as our desired year. Just choose whichever, the most recent year that you can. Now, once we click Calculate, we get a whole bunch of different answers. But we can narrow it down to just those that have to do with a commodity. Okay, a commodity is something that an average person or consumer might buy. So these are the calculations that are relevant for our purposes. And in our next videos, we'll consider what to do if your object of interest is an income or wealth, or if it's a project. Now, the question is then, how do we narrow down these possible answers? Let's go back to the slides, and we'll talk about each of these answers. Here I've produced a table that shows the 4 main results we get. This is further developed in Tutorial 4 on MeasuringWorth.com if you'd like to read more. Our first result is called the real price, and it uses the CPI. Notice we get nearly the same result as we got when we did some of the calculation ourselves. The other results differ only in that they use a different deflator, or measure of the increase in prices over time. Thus, they are asking slightly different questions about the value of the Model T. The real value comes from using the value of the consumer bundle as our deflator. This is a good alternative to the CPI because the CPI measures only inflation for a fixed basket of goods. Thanks to economic growth, though, we are generally able to consume more over time. The VCB adjusts for both changes in inflation and changes in consumption over time, hence we get something larger. You can think of this as a better reflection of the effect that spending $850 would have on the average person's budget back then, when people generally consumed much less than we do today. The labor value comes from using the unskilled wage or the production worker wage as the deflator. This is better if instead of how much the Model T cost in terms of the goods and services that money could buy, or the effect on the budget, we want to know how much people would have to earn to pay for a Model T. Wages have risen faster than prices and consumer budgets. Recall that the CPI increased about 3% a year, but wages were increasing at about 5% per year. Therefore, we get even larger estimates for the value of the Model T. You can think of it this way. In 1909, $850 represented about 2 years' wages for a production worker. Given the growth in unskilled and production worker wages over time, that 2 years' wages now would be about $95,200 or $154,000. So this is today's equivalent of about 2 years' wages. Finally, the income value uses GDP per capita as the deflator. GDP per capita is a broader measure of income, including not just the growth of wages, but also interest, rent, and profits. This would represent how much the average person would have to earn from all sources today to be comparable to a person spending $850 on a Model T in 1909. Notice that there is no one correct answer to the question, what is the value of a 1909 Model T Ford in today's dollars? It depends on if by value you mean how much it cost in terms of a fixed basket of goods, a basket of goods that expanded over time, or how much income you would need to earn and save to buy it. A lot of people are confused by the wide variation in these values indicating that buying a Model T was the equivalent of buying a small basic car today, all the way up to buying a high-performance luxury car today. If you focus, though, on the question you are trying to answer, you can narrow it down to the value that best answers that question. Also notice that the answers differ more the further back in time you go. If you look for the value of a car you bought 5 years ago, each of the deflators will give a very similar value. In that case, it doesn't matter as much which deflator you use because the differences in growth rates are only compounded over a few years. So that's all for today's video. I hope this is helpful. Please look out for more videos to come.